Welcome back to凯達格蘭Forum 2021 Asia-Pacific Security Dialogue. Now we'll proceed to the panel discussion 1, Taiwan Strait Contingency and the Challenge to the Indo-Pacific Liberal Order. We would like to invite the moderator, Deputy Secretary General of National Security Council, Republic of China, Xu Zijian. Please welcome.
Thank you. Welcome you all to this session. I'm very honored to be able to host this panel. Today we have four distinguished panelists. Let me briefly introduce them. First, Mr. Randall Shriver. I believe many of you knows him very well. He is currently the chairman of Project 2049 Institute, and he was the previous Assistant Secretary for Indo-Pacific Security Affairs of the Department of Defense from January 2018 to December 2019. The last time I believe I met with him was when he gave a talk in INDSR in Taipei in February 2020. So welcome, Randy. Second is Ms. Makishima Karen. Ms. Makishima is a member of the House of Representatives of Japan, and she is also, for those who know Japanese politics, she is also the director of Youth Division of LDP, and I believe you understand how important that position is. She is also earned a PhD from the International Christian University, and also a professor. And last time I believe I was with her was in 2018 when I accompanied her in my capacity of Deputy Foreign Minister to meet with President Tsai Ing-wen, and that was a very pleasant memory. Welcome, Ms. Makishima. The next is Mr. Richard Moe. Mr. Richard Moe right now is the Executive Director of Policy of Asia Society Policy Institute, the famous ASPI. And Mr. Moe was the Deputy Secretary of Indo-Pacific Group of Australian Department of Foreign Affairs. I believe I hosted a banquet for him in my capacity of Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs during his visit in Taiwan in October 2019. Welcome, Mr. Moe. Last but not the least, also a good friend of mine, Mr. Anthony Bondas. He is the research fellow and the director of the Taiwan program at the Foundation of Research in the France Research Institute. And I believe in 2019, we met twice, once in Paris, another time was in Taipei when I hosted his speech in the Institute of Diplomacy and International Affairs. So welcome you all. In the sequence that I introduced, you shall have 10 minutes each for your presentation. Afterwards, we shall have Q&A. So let's start with Mr. Shriver, please.
Great. Well, thank you, Mr. Deputy Secretary General. It's great to see you again, and thank you to friends at the Prospect Foundation and MOFA for organizing this discussion and for inviting me to participate. And thank you also for putting me on a virtual panel with such distinguished colleagues. I very much am honored to join them and look forward to their remarks and learning from them. In 10 minutes, I want to try to make 6 quick points. And I want to start in a place we don't usually start when we talk about the Taiwan Strait, but I think given recent events, it's important to give brief mention to Afghanistan, because there are some claims being made. Our CCP and Chinese friends are giving warnings to Taiwan that they'll be abandoned and treated like the Afghan central government in Kabul was when we announced our evacuation and rapidly pulled out. Our friends in the Biden administration are saying things like, actually, once we get through this immediate operation and some of the difficulties, we'll have more troops, we'll have more time and attention, we'll have more money to spend on the Indo-Pacific in competition with China. And I just want to warn or at least express caution on both those fronts. I think for the Chinese, obviously, they are messaging in this way because it serves their broader information operations campaign to try to win without fighting, try to break the will of Taiwan and create the belief that Taiwan will be abandoned. But it's quite interesting that the Chicago Council of Global Affairs just released a poll now that 52% of Americans say that we should defend Taiwan if attacked by China, if China attempts to invade. That's the highest of all time, and it's the first time it's over 50% of the American population in this particular poll. Polling was in July, maybe didn't coincide exactly with these events in Afghanistan, but I think it speaks to a growing awareness of Taiwan's importance, irrespective of what's unfolding in Afghanistan and what has unfolded. In fact, the last plane left at 3:29 today, the last C-17. So I would encourage our Taiwan friends to understand that despite our difficulties in departing Afghanistan, there is strong commitment to Taiwan that remains. But I would also be wary of some of the other promises. You know, we had less than a brigade of troops in Afghanistan. So this notion of redistributing a lot of military might is probably inaccurate. The time and attention issue remains to be seen. Certainly, with the reemergence of ISIS-K and potentially Al-Qaeda, time and attention may be devoted in a different way to Afghanistan, but it certainly won't completely depart. And even resources, you know, we had difficulty sometimes coming up with the true cost of war in Afghanistan because you pay soldiers no matter where they're deployed, you provide them equipment, they train. Certainly the $5 billion that we were providing to the Afghan National Security Forces, given the Taliban takeover, will be savings realized. But beyond that, I think we should have modest expectations in terms of what can actually be reinvested in the Indo-Pacific. So I think the message here is, for the short term, certainly we're bogged down and diverted. For the longer term, I'm still very bullish on the U.S. relationship with Taiwan, America's commitment to Taiwan's defense, and to the greater competition with China to secure a free and open Indo-Pacific. Much more could be said about Afghanistan, but really we want to talk about the Indo-Pacific region this evening. So point number two, our competition with China is about the free and open order in the Indo-Pacific. China does seek to undermine that free and liberal order and create a regional architecture that is more accommodating to its authoritarian model, and that will have a region and countries resident in the region more deferential to Chinese interests in a variety of ways. We see this in documents, speeches. It's something that my institute documents a great deal. But this particular panel is talking about a contingency, so I would add to point number two, not only is this the objective they seek, they are building a military that is growing in capabilities, and it's growing in capabilities more and more quickly, with a specific aim of exerting influence and exerting the ability to change that regional architecture and bend it more in their favor. We have a very bad history in the United States in our analytical community predicting how fast the PLA will modernize and when they'll reach milestones we've underestimated at most junctures. But at this point, we can certainly see that their investments are paying off, and they are able to at least intimidate and coerce Taiwan with greater frequency and regularity. We certainly see that in the fighter flights crossing the center line with greater frequency and greater numbers, with the bomber flights that circumvent the island. But another cautionary note, I would be wary of timelines. We've heard 6 years. We've heard maybe somewhere out closer to 2049. This is a dynamic environment that we can impact and we can affect. And there are still some very long poles in the tent for the PLA. I think strategic lift remains a huge problem for them. It remains axiomatic. You have to have soldiers with rifles and bayonets to take and hold ground and exert your will over an otherwise unwilling population. And they just don't have the lift at this point and the confidence they could get the necessary people across the Taiwan Strait. And add to that, This is a military that hasn't seen combat since 1979, meaning that no one in the PLA at the operational level has experienced any combat. And they don't train in highly complex environments yet. They're improving, but they're not there yet. So to think that they could pull this off in 5 or 6 years, I'm a bit skeptical. But I think we should have some sense of urgency. Point number 3, I think Taiwan is getting more serious about competing and its deterrence capabilities in a variety of ways. I think President Tsai has set a very good tone. She's commented on the situation in Afghanistan and noted that she has confidence in the U.S. as a partner, but also understands that Taiwan is first and foremost responsible for its own defense, not to be outsourced to anyone else. And I do believe the concepts laid out in the overall defense concept are appropriate and correct for the defense of Taiwan and strengthening its deterrence. So the acquisition strategy, the training, the doctrine that will follow, I think Taiwan is on a good path. Perhaps a more robust effort in terms of the timeline is warranted, but I think, again, Taiwan is on a good path and is getting more serious about competition. Point number 4, the U.S. is getting more serious. I mentioned the Chicago Council poll. American support for Taiwan is strong. But within the Defense Department, our whole national defense strategy in the last administration, which has largely been adopted by the Biden administration, reorients the entire defense enterprise to competing more effectively with China. And much of that involves relooking our efforts to strengthen deterrence in the Taiwan Strait. There are plenty of things involved in that I can't go into detail on, but I would leave you with an impression. I do believe we are more serious about fighting in realistic ways, fighting the China that we would have, not the one we wish we had, and dealing with all their growing capabilities in a potential Taiwan contingency. And that's not because we're looking for a fight, but because we want a strong deterrent capability so we can avoid the fight. And I do think we're on a better track there. Point number 5, I won't go into great detail on, but I do think our friends and allies and partners are getting more serious about a Taiwan contingency and about the threat to the free and open order. I wouldn't presume to speak for anyone on this panel because I think you'll address the perspective from your respective countries. But my time as Assistant Secretary, I certainly spent time with representatives of each of the countries on this call, and the greater depths that we went into on Taiwan, on the Indo-Pacific, it was truly encouraging. And continue to see that showing up in public. Prime Minister Suga's joint statement with President Biden. I see that from other leaders. And I'm just encouraged and look forward to the remarks of my colleagues on that. The final point, the stakes are high and they're growing. And I like the title of this panel, the Taiwan Contingency and the Implications for the Free and Open Order or the Liberal Order. Because the United States is serious about this, not because we have an affinity for Taiwan, although we do. That same Chicago Council poll revealed that Americans have never felt greater affinity or warmth. They call it a warmth meter or temperature meter. That's at an all-time high. It's not because we have an important trade relationship, although we do. Taiwan is our 10th largest trading partner, 10th or 11th, depending on the year, which counts. Number 10 counts, even though it's a small country of 23 million people. The trade volumes punch way above their weight. It's not even because of the reliance on semiconductors, although that's true. It's not because of our legal obligations, although the Taiwan relations language is quite strong in terms of what constitutes a grave threat to American interests. It is because Taiwan has become the modern-day Asia fold gap. It is the key to securing the free and open order in the Indo-Pacific. If you remember your Cold War history, Fulda Gap in Western Germany was the area which we absolutely had to hold. If we lost it, we would not be able to secure the freedom and safety of our allies in Western Europe. It was such key territory. If you pull out a map now, Taiwan holds that ground in the Indo-Pacific. It would be extraordinarily difficult to defend the Ryukyu Island chains, Miyako Straits, all those areas in southern Japan were Taiwan to be lost. It would be incredibly difficult to secure the free navigation through the South China Sea if Taiwan was a base of operation for the PLA in addition to these military outposts they've constructed, it'd be very difficult to look at the second island chain and out to Oceania, where we all have interest, but particularly our French allies who have holdings in the South Pacific and have a great interest there. These challenges would be extraordinarily difficult, if not impossible, to secure our interests with the loss of Taiwan. So it is for that reason, for the protection of the free and open order, that Taiwan's security is important to all of us and why we are getting more serious about strengthening deterrence. Much more to be said, but I see I've gone a little bit over and look forward to the discussion so we can go into greater depth.
Well, great. Thank you, Randy, for your very lucid presentation. Next, we welcome Representative Makishima. Please.
Thank you very much for organizing凱達格蘭 Forum 2021 Asia-Pacific Security Dialogue. I'm Karen Makishima, member of the House of Representatives, Japan. Today, I'm attending this event as Director of Youth Division of Liberal Democratic Party of Japan. And this is my second opportunity to attend this event, and it is a great honor to be part of this forum. First of all, I would like to talk about the history of the LDP, Liberal Democratic Party Youth Division, and Taiwan. In 1967, when President Chiang Ching-kuo visited Japan as the chief of China Youth Corps, he suggested exchanges between young generations, and since then, LDP Youth Division has been the counterpart of Taiwan. Around the country, local lawmakers and civilians under the age of 45 act as LDP Youth Division, and every year we visit Taiwan for training. I'm very sorry that we could not visit Taiwan this year because of COVID-19. In various countries, we respond to COVID-19, but Taiwan's movements have also attracted attention in Japan. Your high-risk management capabilities are highly regarded. In Japan, many say that it is strange that Taiwan cannot participate in WHO, even though infectious diseases are bloodless issues. We are also grateful for the donation of medical masks and protective clothing. I feel the friendship of Taiwan that always supports us in times of need, including natural disasters. We, as friends of Taiwan, feel the duty and responsibility to ship COVID-19 vaccines to Taiwan. We could see many friendly tweets on Twitter on this matter. The Taiwan Culture Center in Tokyo has hosted Thank You Japan Manga Expo, and I enjoyed seeing beautiful paintings by Taiwanese famous comic artists illustrating friendship of Taiwan and Japan. In this way, I think we can make occasions to deepen our friendship, even when we cannot travel each other. At All Japan Training Workshop of Youth Division Ambassador Shea Chan-tin joined our event and delivered the speech to participants all over Japan. He sent us the important message: peace is the status to keep the balance of power. The disruption of power gets unstable. Taiwan should cooperate with the United States and Japan that share the value of freedom and democracy to regain the balance and keep the stability. These strong words were delivered to our colleagues and friends. The United States is still a player in terms of Asia-Pacific security. A reduced U.S. commitment to Taiwan's security would accelerate China's growing relative power in the Taiwan Strait, potentially increasing the risk of armed conflicts. Therefore, we were so much relieved to see that they included a reference to Taiwan when Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga of Japan and the United States President Joe Biden issued a joint statement in April. It was the first time in 52 years that leaders of the two countries touched on the territorial issues in a joint statement. We underscore the importance of peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait and encourage the peaceful resolution of cross-strait issues, the statement said. I take this year's statement to be epoch-making. Since then, more Japanese have come to listen to the speeches and messages by Beijing carefully. And we observed well how they celebrated 100 years of the Chinese Communist Party. President Xi Jinping said, "No one should underestimate the great resolve, the strong will, and the extraordinary ability of the Chinese people to defend their national sovereignty and territorial integrity." It was a clear reference to the United States, and we Japanese do remember that he mentioned the reunification of Taiwan. Deputy Prime Minister Taro Aso has signaled that Tokyo would consider a Chinese invasion of Taiwan as an existential threat to its security, allowing Japan to help defend the self-ruled island with the United States. He said if a major incident happened over Taiwan, it's safe to say it will be related to a situation threatening the survival of Japan. If that is the case, Japan and the United States must defend Taiwan together. At a separate news conference the same day, Chief Cabinet Secretary Katsunobu Kato, the government's top spokesperson, refrained from directly commenting on Minister Aso's remarks, but he stressed the importance of a peaceful resolution to the issue. On the same day of the 100th anniversary, Japan and the United States carried out a surface-to-air drill on Amami Oshima, part of the Nansei Islands, roughly 850 kilometers from Taiwan. 40 members of the Ground Self-Defense Force and 30 U.S. Army soldiers gathered and showed the Allies' ability. The drill was intended to simulate defensive maneuvers against hostile aircraft and missiles. During the Cold War, when the Allies were focused on the Soviet threat, joint drills were operated in Hokkaido, the far north of Japan. But the Asia-Pacific security landscape has shifted, and the Allies need the ability to respond quickly to an invasion of Taiwan or Japan's Senkaku Islands. Commander of the U.S. Army Japan also said the Nansei Islands are vulnerable to hostile forces. It was important to show that the United States and Japan are ready to jointly defend the islands in an emergency. These were the pictures we had at the beginning of July 2021. Therefore, there were little surprise when Japan has, for the first time, referred to the importance of stability around Taiwan in its annual defense report last month. Stabilizing the situation surrounding Taiwan is important for Japan's security and the stability of the international community, the paper said. Defense Minister Nobuo Kishi said at the press conference when asked why Taiwan's stability was mentioned in the report. With military activities in the East and South China Seas and around Taiwan becoming more active, we need to pay more attention to the military trends of the two countries, United States and China, in the Indo-Pacific region. In this way, we feel the severe situation of Taiwan Strait and importance of allies among countries that share the same value. COVID-19 makes it difficult to meet physically, but I think we need to communicate and share information more often than before. Lastly, I'd like to express my gratitude to all of you for your arrangement. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Representative Makishima, for sharing with us your very clear view from Japan on the situation around Taiwan Strait and in the region. Next, let's welcome Mr. Mo. Mr. Richard Mo, time is yours, please.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Secretary General. My last visit to Taipei that you mentioned seems like an age ago now. So much has happened, but I remember it well. I was very grateful for your hospitality and very nice to see you again. The quality of our discussions left a lasting impression on me, but so too did the quality of the tea and the Taiwanese whiskey that I left with. And these are obviously two essential components of life. Thanks very much for the conveners of this forum and for the opportunity to speak and to appear with Randy and Karen and Antoine. I've got a couple of thoughts on contingencies from an Australian perspective. We're a very long way south, of course, but we are deeply engaged on the contest in the Indo-Pacific, as I'm sure you know. So a few thoughts about contingencies from an Australian perspective, and then a few thoughts about policy responses. And I think in Australia, there's definitely a refocus recently on the Taiwan Strait and about possible contingencies and the challenge that those contingencies will pose to rules-based order. There's a sense, I think, that we stand at the threshold of a potentially very dangerous tipping point, a point where the increased pressure that China is already bringing to bear on Taiwan could suddenly escalate and expand in ways that would pose very severe challenges, not just for Taiwan, of course, but for Taiwan's friends and partners. In saying that, I share personally Randy's caution about deadlines and about potentially overstating the risks of any kind of imminent full-blown military intervention. I don't personally see that as being imminent, and I think the potential costs and risks of that for China, for President Xi and for the party are still very significant. And to quote the analyst John Culver, it seems to me it's likely that for China, that kind of military intervention is still a risk to be avoided rather than being seen as an opportunity to be seized. But I do think there are some caveats to that. I'm really conscious that that calculation could shift later on, perhaps even later in this decade, as the balance of the power in the region, or at least Xi's perception of it, begins to change. And because of the opaqueness of the China system, it's really hard to know just how impatient Xi Jinping might be to force Taiwan under Chinese sovereignty in his political lifetime, or what price he might be prepared to pay for that. I think one thing we do know, and that's regardless, putting aside the scenario of a full-blown military intervention, we do know that China around the world is now significantly more willing to use coercive measures to achieve its objectives, and much less concerned about adverse international reaction to that. So I think the contingency that, or the contingencies that from an Australian perspective we're most focused on now is that the pressure that Taiwan is under right now could intensify, and that China's objective could shift very, very clearly and decisively from limiting Taiwan's diplomatic space and deterring moves towards independence, towards an attempt to actually force Taiwan to negotiate on terms for unification. And as I think everyone on this panel knows, and indeed I'm sure most of the audience knows, if they so choose, China has a range of measures that it could use: economic sanctions or trade suspensions, covert operations and co-option, limited use of military force, perhaps the occupation of a Taiwan-controlled island in the Strait or the South China Sea, stepping up even further cyber attacks, going after critical infrastructure, potentially even blockades of Taiwan's ports or attempts to close airspace. And so those kinds of actions would be really a huge, serious challenge, not just to stability, but to the rules-based order that we're talking about in this panel. And the democratic world will never, can never, in my view, accept such attempts to compel unification through force or coercion. So what could we do about it? Well, here's where I wanted to come to a couple of policy thoughts. Being a policymaker, I tend to ask, well, what then can we do? And like Randy, I've got 6 points here. There's a little bit of overlap in them. And in offering these 6 points, I'm conscious that there are deeper experts on this challenge than me here today. Firstly, Taipei must continue to prudently protect and advance Taiwan's legitimate international profile, as the Tsai Ing-wen administration has been doing. And I think it's really noticeable that Taiwan's success in handling the COVID-19 crisis, for example, and its leadership on semiconductors are two areas that have earned dignity and respect for Taiwan on the international stage. Second is the point about Taiwan being able to demonstrate credibly its preparedness to effectively defend itself. Randy talked about this. Deterrence of forced unification has many layers, of course, but surely now more than ever it must begin with really visible evidence to Beijing that Taiwan has both the will and the capabilities to fight. And like Randy, I saw and read and noticed and took note of President Tsai's own strong call in recent days for Taiwan to act now, as she said, to lay a sound foundation for the security, freedom and democracy of Taiwan. I think there's a broader point here about strength and deterrence, and that is that investing in Taiwan's resilience as a nation, your domestic strength, continues to be really important to deterrence. And by that I mean the capacity and health of Taiwan's economy, the strength of your technological base, the strength of your institutions of state, and also the cohesiveness of your society. And then thirdly, looking beyond Taiwan, there's a task here, of course, for Taiwan's partners and friends, and that's to find where we can international space for Taiwan to strengthen our bilateral economic relations, and above all, to do what we can to deter Chinese military action, including by helping Taiwan defend itself. There's a narrow path to walk here. It would be counterproductive to stoke the paranoia that we already see in Beijing that Taiwan's partners, especially the United States, seeks themselves to change the status quo. And there are clear signs, I think, that the Biden administration understands that that's the narrow path it must walk. My fourth point is that I think the further internationalization of the Taiwan challenge will be really helpful. Both Randy and Karen touched on this. And so we need to demonstrate that China, that maintaining the peaceful democratic system on Taiwan is not just a cross-strait issue, it is a global concern. So the first mention of Taiwan in a G7 statement is welcome. Taiwan's being discussed in the quadrilateral security dialogue, which is good. And as Karen said, Japan, in a very striking way, has made it clear in recent weeks how much its own security rests on peace across the Taiwan Strait. My fifth point is that while the US doctrine of strategic ambiguity avoids pinning Washington to any one specific response in a crisis, that flexibility doesn't have to come at the expense of deterrence. And Washington and Taiwan's other partners must continue to do what they can to impress on China's leadership the folly of underestimating collective will to respond to military action against Taiwan. We need to keep telling China that more coercive pressure on Taiwan will come with rising costs for Beijing, including the hardening of the coalition we already see coming together now to balance China's power in the Indo-Pacific. And moreover, that any attempt to take Taiwan by force would be a shock to the global system like we've not seen for decades. and that Beijing should not expect, could not hope that the world would ultimately acquiesce to that. And we must keep underlining how damaged China would be morally, economically, politically, and strategically by such action. And then my last point goes to those kind of grey zone, step up in grey zone action that I mentioned. We need to think harder about how we can respond to that. There are signs that the United States and its partners are doing that. Clearly, they're doing it quietly for all the obvious reasons. But some of those scenarios pose really difficult challenges about how best to respond, both for Taiwan and Taiwan's partners. So they do need to be thought through. And the challenge is to find responses, effective responses that don't raise escalatory risks. As a starting principle, any intensification of coercive measures against Taiwan should not come cost-free to Beijing. So I'll leave my comments there and look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Moat. I particularly appreciate that you give very specific policy recommendations, and each and every one of them worth further discussion. With that, let's welcome the fourth panelist, Mr. Bondas. Bondas, floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Secretary General, and it's an honor to meet you all again for this Kitagalan Forum 2021 edition. And it's a great pleasure to be among friends, especially with friends from Prospect Foundation, MOFA, as well as the US, Japan, and Australia. And like last year, I will do my best to present you with a European perspective in this panel. Last year, actually, I pointed out that there was an awakening in Europe on the importance of Taiwan, and an awakening in Taiwan on the importance of Europe. And I was not mistaken. This double dynamic is now perfectly clear and is even accelerating. And this is an excellent thing. I will briefly present 3 examples that illustrate actually that trend. The first one is that in 1 year, Taiwan's diplomatic network has added 2 posts in Europe, one in Aix-en-Provence in France, and soon in Vilnius in Lithuania. And far from being isolated, the island is more than ever connected to the world, partly thanks to your excellent diplomats based in Europe. And I want to congratulate and thank all of these diplomats who defend the interests of every Taiwanese abroad. The channels of communication with Europe are now multiple. And the launch of a Taiwan program within my foundation, the first research program dedicated actually to Taiwan security and diplomacy in Europe, is a striking example. The expansion of Taiwan's diplomatic network in Europe has, as you know, angered Beijing. And the Global Times recently called for Lithuania to be punished and to be made to pay the price. And economic sanctions are beginning to target the country. However, Europeans have stood together. And a few days ago, 13 Foreign Affairs Committee chairmen from 11 European countries gave their support to Lithuania. Developing ties with the Taiwanese people is our most fundamental right. And in the face of sanctions, it's very important that the EU member states and all the Europeans implement a so-called sponge strategy to collectively absorb the costs of these sanctions and make them unnecessary. And we must fight China's economic coercion through EU solidarity, European solidarity, much more than escalation. Second, the European Parliament is increasingly active on Taiwan. A January 2021 resolution on EU's foreign and security policy has, for the first time, an entire paragraph on Taiwan. The Parliament also held a hearing in February 2021, whose main topic was tensions in the Taiwan Strait. And above all, the Parliament presented last spring a draft of a recommendation that the Union should sign a comprehensive and enhanced partnership with Taiwan, start negotiation on a bilateral investment agreement, and change the name of the current European Economic and Trade Office in Taiwan into the European Union Office in Taipei in order to reflect the broader scope of our ties. Thirdly, in France, the evolution is also considerable. I often criticized over the last few years the so-called invisibilization of Taiwan in official documents. However, as a member of the G7, France signed a declaration in June 2021 calling for peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. The next day, the EU and the US made the same statement. Most importantly, France is beginning to address the issue on a bilateral basis. And yesterday, for the very first time in a bilateral meeting, in this case, the 2+2 France-Australia Defense and Foreign Affairs Minister meeting, the Taiwan Strait was mentioned. This is a very important development. Meanwhile, the French Senate unanimously voted for a resolution calling for Taiwan's integration into international organization when its statutes allows it. And my personal experience in defending the right of French senators to go to a parliamentary visit to Taiwan, as they do every year, earned me public insults from the Chinese embassy and led to the Chinese ambassador to be summoned by the Ministry of Europe and Foreign Affairs in Paris. As a result of these three trends, we have never spoken so publicly about Taiwan in Europe and in France. A year ago, I explained to you that this was an indispensable initial objective to start talking about Taiwan. And we have achieved it, de facto. This is an excellent thing, and it's obviously not enough. Talking about Taiwan is one thing, but we must go further and make the Europeans aware of the need to do more, and especially to do more in maintaining peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. Europeans are actually increasingly aware of their interest in the Indo-Pacific. This is not the subject of this panel, of course, but France has presented its own Indo-Pacific strategy as early as 2018. Germany and the Netherlands did so in 2020, and the European Union will, in actually 2 weeks, present its own. Yet there is a huge discrepancy still between the demonstrated European interest in the Indo-Pacific and Europe's readiness to think about what its role would be in a crisis scenarios. There is a urgent need to address this deficit if Europe is not only to defend its interests, but also participate in preventing a conflict in the Taiwan Strait from happening. To be clear, conflict scenarios are not limited to the widespread caricature in Europe of a massive Chinese invasion of Taiwan. Despite this, most Europeans have yet to fully realize that a unilateral change of the status quo by force would have far-reaching consequences not limited to the Taiwan Strait, and that Europe could not stay idle without incurring serious cost. Far from remaining local and limited to China and Taiwan, any conflict would be much more global in scale. It would involve at least the US and potentially Japan, as well as other US treaty allies in the region, all countries that are actually essential and economic and security partners for Europe. And while the NATO treaty does not cover the Indo-Pacific region, European solidarity would be tested if China were to threaten the US mainland. In the event of such a contingency, Europe would be neither without a role nor without leverage to defend its interest. European countries could support friends and allies politically, including at the Security Council, as well as militarily by sharing intelligence or so-called backfilling the US military presence if needed, for instance in the Middle East, and possibly through NATO. European countries and the EU could also impose political and economic costs on China and apply pressure on China within international organizations. Yet, as European policymakers prepare for responding to and intervening in such conflict scenarios, they must understand that they have an even bigger role to play in preventing them from happening in the first place. In close coordination with partners in the Indo-Pacific, European governments and the EU should adopt a visible and credible strategy to deter China by convincing China that any unilateral change of the status quo by force would be too risky and too costly. Such a strategy should be based on several short-term, consensus-based and multi-level initiatives. First, Europe should keep strengthening its declaratory diplomacy and better signal its interests and resolve to China. Europeans should take every opportunity to clearly and publicly state that they are strongly opposed to any unilateral change of the status quo by force and would not stand by in the event of a conflict. Second, Europeans must resist both China's diplomatic pressure and its desire to impose its narrative. Parliamentary exchanges must not only continue, they should be expanded to include, for example, a joint parliamentary delegation of the European Parliament as well as national parliaments, including the UK. This would send a huge message of unity and firmness, while also raising awareness among European constituencies of Taiwan-related issues. Third, Europeans should begin preparing contingency plan for conflict scenarios now, given the slowness of crisis response, discussion, and decision-making process at the European level. This coordination effort should include Europe's partner in the Indo-Pacific, including the Americans, the Japanese, the Australians, as well as civil society groups in Europe and in Taiwan to facilitate and multiply interaction between them. The role of think tank, of course, in this context is crucial to creating spaces for discussion and exchanges. Europe has belatedly begun to realize that the Indo-Pacific centrality to the global stage and the decisive importance of Taiwan. But to be a credible actor there, we need to do more, and the Europeans must prepare for a conflict contingency involving Taiwan, as this is the best hope actually to help in preventing it from occurring. So thank you all. I can stop before stopping, of course, to show off as well as the ambassador, the Taiwanese black bear that we all have. And since I'm actually right now in Paris, I wanted to congratulate the Taiwanese athletes at the Tokyo Olympics, and especially the 12 medals they got. And we are really looking forward to host all the Taiwanese athletes in Paris in 3 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bondas. Very encouraging messages from you. And thank you also for laying out your vision on what Europe should do to prevent the Taiwan contingency from happening. And the following, let's make the best use of the time for our discussion. So first of all, let me read out some of the questions that we have collected from our website. First of all, from Mr. Roland Frodenstein, the policy director of the Martens Center in Brussels, and from October, the Vice President of GlobeSec. The question reads, if our common struggle against the CCP is about defending freedom and the liberal democracy, then to what extent can the West cooperate with authoritarian governments that also jostle with China and its allies, such as Vietnam, Saudi Arabia, UAE, etc.? Isn't there a contradiction in Western policy? I think it's a serious dilemma, and I'm asking this question not for the sake of problems, not for the sake of polemics. So, any one of you would like to respond to that serious dilemma?
I'll have a crack if you like, and then
Please.
The other panelists can come in and correct me. Look, a couple of thoughts on that. One is that it's nearly, as a practitioner, I can tell you, it's nearly impossible to run foreign policy in a complex world without accumulating the odd contradiction or two. So, all countries' foreign policies have contradictions embedded in them, and I think this is a contradiction that, at least to some extent, we are going to have to live in. My own personal view is that it's become increasingly important for countries like Australia and America and Japan and the EU, the countries in the EU and India, to make it clear the values that we believe in and to act and to support democracy. I think we're in that kind of world, and clearly that's President Biden's ambition, that we will stand up for the system that we believe is best. And that has to be a significant part of our foreign policy. But we can't push that so far that it excludes cooperation with countries that are not like us. That would be self-defeating. So we do have to find ways to work with Vietnam, for example, even though it too is a one-party country. And that's just going to be part of the world we live in. And we can still, in working with Vietnam, we can still, as the US Vice President did recently, talk to them about their own human rights record and the things that we have concerns about, the way they run their system. And then the last point I'd make is that I think it's wrong to try and imply that a country like Vietnam is the same as China, right? It's just a totally different situation. Vietnam is not trying to impose its will on the Indo-Pacific. Vietnam is not trying to create a regional order in which countries must defer to its interests or authority. So let's not think for a moment that the comparison is an apt one.
Thank you very, very much, Mr. Mo. I used to be a scholar, doing research for decades, and now I'm in the policy position, and I came to the understanding that the real world is much more complicated than what the textbook tells us. So if you allow me, let me go to the next question. This question comes from Mr. Huang Yanying, who is associate researcher of Mainland Affairs Council in Taiwan. The question reads, two American panelists, maybe Randall, the Biden administration has reviewed its China policy in terms of defense and trade, but they didn't publish or share it with ally country. How do you see this? Can you please portray the policy review? Thank you.
I think it was important for the Biden administration to come in and do a review of a particular kind, which really was to have a good accounting for what had transpired the previous 4 years in the Trump administration and to really understand what status quo ante was for them. A lot of these people served in the Obama administration, but it's a very different China, even just 4 years later, and it's a very different U.S.-China relationship. I know the review at the Pentagon, led by my good friend Eli Ratner, was mostly just that, accounting for where the defense enterprise had moved to in its implementation of the National Defense Strategy, understanding the various initiatives. It was less a review about let's overhaul and change policy and let's inject an inflection point here and turn things in a different direction. So there are different types of reviews, I guess, when you're on the practitioner side. I'll join Richard on that front. This one was mostly just to get a sort of baselining and an understanding of status quo ante. And you'll notice they really haven't changed a great deal of policy, particularly on the defense side. Now, there may be some other issues going on here. I've heard very little from the Biden administration on trade with respect to any country. Trade is a very difficult issue for this administration, given the domestic politics here in the United States. Very difficult for a Democrat president and two houses of the Congress controlled by Democrats. And a lot of controversy over previous trade liberalization efforts. So they're just not saying much on trade at all. So I think it's a mix of things. I do hope that the consultations with allies and partners is ultimately strengthened. I think there is a broad understanding in the Biden administration that for us to be successful in our competition with China, it can't be us in the boat rowing alone. We need to have like-minded partners who not only see the strategic landscape and the challenges the same way, but are committed to policies and particular collaboration that will raise all our games and help us all be optimally positioned for competition. We can't do it alone and shouldn't endeavor to do so. So I think to the extent friends and allies have questions about these reviews, have questions about the direction of policy, I do hope there's better transparency and better dialogue.
Great, thank you. Can we have the next question? This question comes from Gary Sands, a senior analyst at Wikistrat. The question reads, over the next decade, what are the chances of China's PLA attempting to take control of the Dongsha Islands as a salami slice test of Taiwanese and Western resolve? I don't know which one of you would like to take this question. Yes, Randy, please.
I guess on the panel here, I have most recent experience in a defense ministry. Look, I think they likely will have the capability to seize an offshore island. They may have it already, particularly given that Taiwan has placed less emphasis on fortifying the offshore islands over the last few years. It would be, comparatively speaking, a much easier operation than trying to seize the Penghu Islands or the main island of Taiwan. But I do believe it would, even if successful, would represent a tactical victory, but a strategic blunder. Surely there'd be international backlash. Surely they would have to face cost imposition of a variety of sorts. And what would they gain in terms of proximity to their ultimate goal of unifying Taiwan with China? I don't think they gain much. They don't gain much militarily. This issue of hearts and minds, which is probably already a lost deal for the Chinese, certainly that would drive that further into the hole for them. I think the resolve of other countries in the region, seeing that China's ambitions were growing and that their willingness to use the military to acquire territory would only strengthen the resolve of other countries. So I would see it as a tactical victory and a strategic blunder. And I can't speak to whether or not Zhong Nunhai and the senior CCP leaders share that view, but I think if you sort of go through the costs and benefits, one would likely come to that conclusion that there's not a lot to be gained for the Chinese.
Okay, thank you. I think this question not only touched upon the scenario over Dongsha Island, but also all the off islands around Taiwan. And I think we understand that the water territories is adjacent to Japan's territories, especially Japan's off-island, and understand in recent months, Japan has made a lot of moves in deploying more capability in the southwestern islands. So I wonder if Representative Makishima can also share with us your observation on that question.
Thank you very much. First of all, I think I should mention the uniqueness of self-defense force of Japan. When they do operate some kind of a defensive strategy actions, or to cooperate with other allies or forces like the United States, Australia, or other friends, and they do consider the situation as a threatening of the survival of Japan. These words are the key concept of Japan. So the Japanese parliamentarians and of course the government of Japan should observe and analyze so much carefully on that issue as the threatening of our country or our allies or our neighbors. So we should consider and discuss each scenario so much carefully. That is the customs we do have in Japan. I think I should explain the situation and the uniqueness of Japanese self-defense force. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I understand that, Randy, in your reply, I think you're referring to the fact that it's really not cost-benefit efficient for or meaningful for PLA to take an off-island like Dongsha. But of course, we do understand there is a possibility as a part of their gray zone strategy, they may make maneuvers, create maneuvers or things like that as part of their coercive strategy. And that not only can happen to the off islands of Taiwan, near Taiwan Straits, but also to the South China Sea. And I understand that Australia has also a grave concern over those kind of scenarios. So I wonder if Richard, can you share with us your observation on that possibilities and Australia's possible response?
I can't quantify the likelihood of such action taking place, but as I said in my remarks, I think we should absolutely be thinking about the possibility of them taking place and then thinking about how we would collectively respond. And perhaps that's already happening inside and between governments. I have less visibility than I once did about what's happening between governments. But if those discussions are not taking place, they absolutely should take place, because we collectively could not afford to look flat-footed in response to such an action, and we would want as much warning as we possibly could of such an action. So, you know, there's an intelligence warning function role here, and then there is a pre-gaming, if you like, the range of responses that Taiwan and its partners could take. And that could be very challenging. For example, from a perspective of a Taiwan president, would Taiwan feel compelled to respond militarily in such a scenario, for example? That may not be actually, in the end, the action that makes most sense to take. That's what I mean when I say some of these choices will be exceptionally difficult, and Taiwan and its partners need to have a menu of responses ready, worked through, that they can roll out quickly. And for Taiwan's partners like Australia, they must impose cost on Beijing. We can talk about how that might happen, but there must be a cost. Such an action cannot be cost-free.
I think, thank you, Richard. What you just mentioned, I think, will be a major takeaway from this session, this panel. I think not only militarily we need to go through our common manual, but also on the diplomatic fronts and political fronts. There are a lot to be discussed among like-minded countries with Taiwan on those possible scenarios, including Europe, because Europe is really important. I believe it is part of China's strategy to drive a wedge between Europe and the US, and to divide, so to speak, the West. And if they are able to do that, then they will make the next bold move. So maybe it's a little bit remote for Europe, geopolitically speaking, but not for France. I understand France is also a Pacific country. You have physical, not a military presence in the Pacific, as well as in the Indo-Indian Ocean. But for many other European countries, it's a little bit remote. So how to work European countries together to make possible response to this small step, pushing the envelope strategy from China is actually critically important. So I wonder, maybe Anton, you want to respond on that?
Sure, I fully agree with you. This is indeed something that is key. I mean, France is a little bit ahead, of course, because of the French territories in the Indo-Pacific. We have more than 1.6 million French people living in French territories in the Indo-Pacific. We have more than 7,000 French troops in the region, etc. So France and the French government, of course, is aware. The collective need now, and as part of the European Union Indo-Pacific strategy that will be presented in 2 weeks, at least the first draft, I think it would be very, very important to make sure that maintaining peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait is mentioned in the European strategy. that everywhere in Europe, from Central Europe to Southern Europe, there is a will to address the issue. Once again, the key message, I think, for the Europeans is not to tell them that they will be militarily involved in case of a contingency, but that they have a role in preventing a conflict. It's not once you have a contingency that Europe will wake up. Europe and Europeans need to wake up because the main role they can play is before in preventing a conflict. And to do so, I think this is very important to have a debate in Europe, a debate that is not constrained by the Chinese narrative, that this is only domestic affairs, that this is about ending the civil war, etc., so-called Chinese civil war, etc. So there is a need in Europe to have a very open debate in which, of course, the Taiwanese, as well as our partners, the American, the Japanese, the Australian, can, of course, share their views. There is a need also at the security level to better understand the dynamic in the regions, including the evolution in Taiwan, in Japan, in terms of anti-access strategies that these countries can put forward, of course, to prevent the PLA from changing the status quo. But something that is also very important is, I think, related to the very initial question. We should not frame it we should not frame it as authoritarian versus democratic countries. This is not only about authoritarian versus democracy. We need to support Taiwan not only because it's a democracy, not only because we have, of course, ties with the country, etc., but because this is in our interest in doing so. This is simply in our interest in maintaining peace and stability in the status quo. For economic reason, for political reason, for diplomatic reason, etc., we need to make sure that the will of the Taiwanese people is being heard. And it's not up to the Chinese people, to the Chinese government, to the CPC or to the PLA to decide for 24 million Taiwanese people. And that's something very basic to explain to the Europeans. It's not, once again, the defense of the democracy against authoritarianism. It's the defense of the will of one people, the Taiwanese people, against another party that is, of course, willing to change unilaterally and by force the status quo.
Thank you, Anton. I believe if more Taiwanese will hear what you said, they will come to tears. Thank you. We have 5 more minutes. Let me read out the last question, which brings us back to the bigger picture of global geopolitics. The question comes from Xie Mengru, who is the Assistant Research Fellow of our host, the Prospect Foundation. The question reads, will China put more efforts in the Middle East after U.S. withdrawal? If so, how will this impact the Indo-Pacific region and the Taiwan Strait specifically? Of course, this is a speculation on China's will, which is a difficult one. But of course, it's a possible scenario. Let's think about that. So I wonder if anyone would like to respond to that. Randy, allow me to start with you.
Sure. I mean, we're all speculating, but I think it's a likely outcome that they'll devote more resources and personnel to the Middle East. The fact is, if you look at just the energy piece, the U.S. is becoming less and less dependent on the region, while China's dependency is growing. We're trying to extract ourselves from conflicts that have really drained our resources and exhausted us in a lot of ways. China's unencumbered by those recent experiences and might be a little more adventurous. I don't think it changes their priority objectives, though. Their interest in resolving these sovereignty questions in their favor, and Taiwan is the sort of, in their mind, the missing piece after Hong Kong. It doesn't change the fact that the proximity of the South China Sea, being able to exert their expansive illegal sovereignty claim there is of high priority. It doesn't change any of that. So, I think China is a big enough country, a great enough power now where they're going to be able to do a variety of things simultaneously, including increasing its efforts in the Middle East. I don't think they're likely to have such a diversion that it will relieve pressure from Taiwan or others in the Indo-Pacific.
Thank you. Richard, I wonder if you want to consume the last few minutes.
Well, just to say that I agree with Randy. I think that's absolutely spot on. And I think there's a bit of a danger in over-reading the way in which China is positioning on Afghanistan. It has obviously some very specific interests there, including its absolute paranoia about terrorism and Xinjiang and so on. And well, speaking of contradictions in foreign policy, the Taliban in a relationship with the Chinese Communist Party is one of those contradictions that's almost impossible to get one's head around when you consider the scale of the human rights abuses in Xinjiang. But China has a specific national interest there. They're going to pursue that in their usual hard-headed way, but I don't think they're going to overinvest in Afghanistan. And if they were to do that, well, good luck to them.
Thank you. I would like to thank you all the four panelists, for sharing with us your wisdom. I just found that I've been standing here for 70 minutes. I don't feel tired at all. I think well because the excellent remarks that you have made and the very in-depth observation you share with us. And I hope all the audience also enjoyed this session as well as I did. And I hope we shall meet pretty soon, either in Taipei or in your capital. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you.